My name is Whitley. I am 33 years old, and as a hospice nurse, I've spent my adult life holding the hands of strangers in the final, quiet hours of their lives. That kind of work teaches you how to keep your voice level when an entire room is coming apart at the seams, a skill I desperately needed on my wedding day. But the gray coats and the sudden, breathless silence that fell over the country club did not begin at those heavy chapel doors. The story really started 3 weeks earlier on Cedar Hollow Drive, in a grand house with a circular driveway designed specifically to make visitors feel small before they ever reach the front porch. Raymond Mayfield loved an audience, and he had invited 11 people to a formal engagement dinner under a crystal chandelier he bragged about importing, making sure the light fell mostly on him. My fiancé, Thane, and I had arrived on time, Thane wearing his one good suit jacket and carrying a carefully selected bottle of wine that my father never even offered to uncork. Instead, my father let Thane stand awkwardly by the sideboard for a full minute before acknowledging his existence. When he finally turned around, he didn't ask about Thane's life or his values. He asked what an ambulance driver earns in a year, delivering the question like a livestock judge appraising an animal at auction. He called Thane a fixer-upper with a pulse and warned the table about the ruinous cost of home renovations, while my 36-year-old brother, Prescott, laughed along to win our father's favor. Across the table, my mother, Ruth, said absolutely nothing. She simply took her linen napkin and folded it once, twice, into a perfect, silent square with edges so sharp they looked engineered. Under the table, Thane rested his hand on my knee, giving me a gentle squeeze that meant, let it go, it cost me nothing. But as we left that night, passing my mother's worn gray wool coat hanging on the side rack, she held my face in the driveway and whispered something that snagged in my mind for weeks. You chose better than you know, my sweet girl. I spent my entire youth terrified of one specific thing, and it was not the poverty or death I witness every day at work. My deepest fear was disappearing, watching myself turn invisible the way my mother had slowly vanished inside her own home, spoken over and ignored until she seemed like little more than a piece of quiet furniture. To protect myself, I swore I would always have a voice, yet a small, ugly part of me still craved my father's approval and wondered if marrying a man without money was the first step onto the exact path that had swallowed my mother whole. That fear flared up when Thane and I sat at our kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, trying to budget a simple wedding on a nurse's salary and a paramedic's wage. When my father called offering to pay for everything, my heart briefly leaped with hope until his conditions came down like a hammer. He demanded we cut Thane's side of the guest list down to 20 people, claiming his family did not photograph well, and insisted his own name be the only one on the official invitations. When I refused to strip my husband's family from our special day, my brother Prescott stepped in 2 days later over a cup of coffee. He pushed a folded paper across the table, asking me to sign away any claim to our father's estate to prove I was not marrying for money, warning me that Raymond had something terrible planned for the ceremony if I kept fighting him on the details. Desperate for a simple crumb of paternal affection, I went to my father's home office, a room decorated with framed awards and a magazine cover praising him as a self-made king. I asked him directly if he would walk me down the aisle, but he merely leaned back in his leather chair and told me we would see if I earned it, leaving me on a leash to wonder and perform until the final hour. That evening, as I sat on our back step in the dark, Thane shared a piece of his past he had never spoken aloud. When he was 13 years old, back in 2006, his mother lost her manufacturing job, and within weeks, they lost their modest apartment, forcing them to sleep in their car behind a freezing shopping center. On a night when the windows iced over on the inside, a woman in an old-fashioned gray wool coat tapped on the glass, offered no judgment, and led them to a warm, safe shelter without ever asking for their names or taking credit. For an entire year, essential supplies, winter coats, and school fees simply appeared at their door, always accompanied by a small note signed only with a single letter, R. Thane admitted he still looked for that gray coat in large crowds, completely unaware that the woman who had saved his childhood was currently sitting at my father's dinner table, folding her napkin into a tight, quiet square. Strange cracks began appearing in my mother's quiet facade over the next 2 weeks. Women in local grocery stores would pause when they saw her, bowing their heads slightly in deep respect before moving along without a word. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, I found a plain envelope on the hall table addressed to Ruth Mayfield, sealed with a gray wax stamp and bearing no return address except that same single initial. When my mother saw me holding it, she did not panic or offer an excuse. She simply took it from my hand with steady fingers and slipped it into her pocket. The subject was closed immediately, but for the first time in my 33 years, I realized with absolute certainty that I did not know the woman who had raised me at all. The tension boiled over during the rehearsal dinner at a dimly lit downtown steakhouse, where my father stood up, tapped his glass, and openly mocked both my fiancé and my mother in front of 30 guests. He told the room that I had a bad habit of picking up strays, comparing Thane to a three-legged dog, before turning his sights on my mother and reminding everyone that she had never amounted to anything in her entire life. I watched Ruth closely, expecting her to shrink into herself as she usually did under his cruel tongue. Instead, she sat perfectly still, looking straight down the long table at her husband with an expression of cold, unhurried patience, like a woman watching a clock that only she could read. The day before the wedding, I went up to my mother's bedroom closet to retrieve my grandmother's lace veil, and my hand brushed against her gray wool coat hanging in the dark. It was wrapped neatly in a protective garment bag, and inside the deep front pocket, my fingers found a heavy brass key worn smooth from decades of use, alongside an old photograph dated 2006. The picture showed a younger Ruth standing outside a plain brick building surrounded by a dozen people, every single one of them wearing identical gray wool coats with dark lettering stitched over the heart. When my mother walked into the room and saw what I was holding, her eyes filled with tears, and she made me swear never to speak of the photo to my father, warning me that Raymond would destroy anything he could not control or own. When our wedding day arrived, the atmosphere inside the country club felt charged and fragile. I stood in the holding room wearing my white dress, watching through the window as plain sedans pulled into the far edges of the parking lot, discharging men and women in slate gray coats who gathered quietly under the oak trees. Inside the main hall, my father had arranged the seating so that Thane's small family looked completely abandoned in a sea of empty, white chairs. But before the music started, a woman in a gray coat walked straight over to Thane's mother, Della, taking her hands in a warm greeting that made Della gasp and stare at the gray fabric in sudden, stunned recognition. I took my place at the back of the chapel alone, holding my bouquet so tightly the stems bit deep into my palms. My father took the officiant's microphone, smiled arrogantly at the crowd, and announced that a woman who marries a nobody gets to walk herself down the aisle, before dropping into the back row to pull my mother down into the seat beside him. The room went dead silent, expecting me to break or run, but I lifted my chin, took a deep breath, and began walking down the long carpet by myself. That was the exact moment the double doors crashed open and 30 people in gray coats marched inside, creating a striking wall of honor along the entire aisle. An older man named Silas stepped out from the line, walked straight up to my father, and spoke my mother's name, Ruth, with an authority that knocked the wind right out of Raymond's chest. My father tried to scramble to his feet, shouting that these strange people were interrupting his daughter's big day, but Silas looked at him with gentle pity and told the entire room why they had come. One by one, the people in gray stepped forward to tell their stories, revealing that for 20 years, my mother had quietly operated a massive shelter network called Greywool, using her key to open safe doors for hundreds of homeless families, single mothers, and cold children across the state. She had funded the entire operation in total secrecy, hiding it beneath the contempt of a husband who was too busy feeling superior to ever notice what his wife was actually doing with her life. As the stories poured out, Thane stood at the altar with tears streaming down his face, realizing that the mysterious woman in the gray coat who had saved his life when he was a cold, terrified 13-year-old boy in a frozen car was the very mother-in-law he had been trying so hard to impress. My father tried to bark orders and regain control of the room, but his loud voice simply evaporated into the air, leaving him looking like a small, pathetic man whose authority had been built entirely on a foundation of cruel lies. My mother stood up from the back row, smoothed her plain gray dress, and walked right past the husband who had spent 30 years trying to make her feel tiny. She told him calmly that he was the only person in the entire county who thought she was nothing, before taking my arm with steady, warm fingers and walking me down the rest of the aisle toward my waiting groom. As we walked together through the corridor of gray coats, every guest in the chapel stood up in deep respect for the quiet woman who had secretly saved hundreds of lives from the dark. My mother gave me the brass key to the gray door after the ceremony, passing down the legacy of the hidden world she had built while everyone was busy looking the other way. I realized then that my mother had never been invisible at all. She had simply chosen where to be seen, using her quiet strength to protect the people who needed her most. Today, that old gray wool coat hangs proudly in the front hallway of our home right beside my husband's jacket, a constant reminder that true power never needs to shout to be heard.